The western desert of Libya, 1942. A British reconnaissance car sits motionless behind a low ridge, engine idling, while three German half-tracks roll into view 500 yards away. For 3 years, this was the moment every British scout crew dreaded. Their orders were simple: watch, report, run. Their armored cars carried machine guns and anti-tank rifles that could barely dent a German fender, let alone its armor. Turning to fight meant dying for nothing. But the gunner in this car does not reach for the radio. He swings the turret, lines up the lead half-track, and fires. The 2-pounder shell tears through steel at 400 yards, and the vehicle erupts in flame before the Germans even understand what hit them. This should not have been possible. No wheeled reconnaissance vehicle in the world carried a gun powerful enough to kill armor and still move fast enough to escape before the enemy recovered. The British were not supposed to have this. A company that built motorcycles and family sedans had somehow solved a problem that stumped tank designers across 2 continents. What they built would fight from the deserts of Libya to the streets of Brussels, and it would still be firing when other, newer vehicles had already been retired. How did a scout car end up hunting tanks? Coffee ready, tea ready, great. Now take one quick look at the clock. What time is it where you're watching from? Tell us below. Then let's begin tonight's story. 2 years before Bir Hakeim, in the summer of 1940, a British reconnaissance patrol crawled along a ridgeline in the western desert in a Marmon Harrington armored car. A boxy vehicle riding on a South African-built chassis with a boy's anti-tank rifle poking out of its turret like an afterthought. The boy's rifle had been designed in the 1930s to punch through the thin skin of early tankettes. Against the frontal plate of a German Panzer, the 14mm round simply flattened and fell away. Crews joked bitterly that the weapon was better suited to hunting rabbits than tanks. Except rabbits did not fire back with high-velocity cannon shells of their own. The other armored cars fielded by British reconnaissance regiments were not much better armed. The Humber carried a 15mm Bisa machine gun, a stouter weapon than the boy's rifle, but still a machine gun at heart, designed to shred infantry and soft-skinned trucks rather than crack open armor plate. The Morris mounted a boy's rifle alongside a standard Bren gun, a combination that gave its crew plenty of ways to make noise and almost no way to kill a tank. When these vehicles rolled into contact with German armored cars carrying 20mm autocannons, the arithmetic of the engagement was brutal. The German gun could open fire at a range where the British weapons were still useless, and it could punch through the light armor, protecting the British crews with ease. The doctrine written for these vehicles assumed this imbalance and tried to work around it rather than fix it. Reconnaissance units existed to observe the enemy and report his strength and direction of movement, then withdraw before contact became decisive. On paper, this was sound cavalry doctrine, refined over centuries of screening and scouting. In practice, against an enemy whose light vehicles could kill at range while British crews could not shoot back, doctrine became a euphemism for running. Patrol after patrol drove out at dawn with orders to find the enemy. And patrol after patrol learned that finding the enemy meant becoming a target the moment contact was made. The cost of this imbalance went beyond the machines themselves. Officers commanding forward reconnaissance troops began to notice a change in the men available for patrol duty. Volunteers who had once competed for the excitement of forward scouting grew quieter, more reluctant, more likely to find reasons to stay with the reserve troop. This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic learned the hard way, through friends killed in vehicles that could not fight back. A trooper sent forward in a Marmon Harrington or a Humber knew that any German armored car he met would very likely see him first, shoot first, and kill him before his own weapon could do anything more than scratch paint. Morale in reconnaissance regiments sagged under the weight of missions that felt less like scouting and more like a lottery with a single losing ticket. The desert itself made the imbalance worse. Heat inside a closed armored car could climb well past 40 degrees Celsius by midday, and crews baking inside their hulls still had to keep watch through narrow vision slits coated in dust, straining to spot an enemy vehicle before it spotted them. At night, the temperature dropped hard enough to leave frost on the metal, and men who had sweated through their shirts by noon shivered through radio watch by 2 in the morning. Fuel and water had to be rationed carefully across patrols that might run for days without resupply, and a mechanical breakdown far from friendly lines could be as dangerous as an enemy shell. Against this backdrop, a vehicle that could not defend itself was not simply an inconvenience. It was a machine that asked its crew to accept every risk of the desert, the heat, the cold, the thirst, the isolation, while offering almost nothing in return if the worst happened and the enemy appeared on the ridgeline ahead. Commanders higher up the chain understood the problem in terms of intelligence rather than individual lives. Though the two were connected, a reconnaissance screen that could not hold its ground, even briefly, produced patchy and unreliable reports. Patrols that broke contact the instant they spotted the enemy often failed to determine unit strength, direction, or intent before withdrawing. Some commanders began asking for tanks to escort their reconnaissance troops, an expensive and inefficient solution that defeated the entire purpose of a lightweight scouting vehicle. What the British desperately needed was a vehicle that combined the speed and low profile of a scout car with a gun powerful enough to make an enemy armored car think twice. Something that could observe, and when observation was not enough, fight its way clear, rather than simply flee. The origins of the answer to this problem, oddly enough, had nothing to do with the desert at all. In 1938, the British War Office issued a specification for a small, fast scouting vehicle to replace motorcycle dispatch riders in the reconnaissance role. The firm that won the contract was the Birmingham Small Arms Company, better known to the British public for motorcycles, bicycles, and small arms than for armored fighting vehicles. BSA passed the design and production work to its subsidiary, the Daimler Motor Company, and the result was a tiny two-man vehicle called the Daimler Scout Car. Soon nicknamed the Dingo, the first order for 172 of these vehicles went out in May 1939. Months before war was even declared, the Dingo was never meant to fight. It was built purely for observation, small enough to hide behind a hedge, fast enough to outrun trouble. Armed with nothing heavier than a machine gun, its crew could fire from within the hull. But the engineering team behind it, led by a designer named Sid Shellard, had built something with unusual bone. The Dingo's transmission and running gear were far more sophisticated than its tiny size suggested, and as reports from the desert began filtering back describing reconnaissance crews outgunned and outmatched, Shellard and his team began asking a different question than the one the War Office had originally posed. Instead of building a better scout car, what if they scaled the same engineering principles up into something that could carry a real gun and still keep the speed and agility that made reconnaissance work in the first place? Work on this larger vehicle began in April 1939, before the fall of France, under the working title Light Tank Wheeled, a name that captured exactly what Shellard's team was attempting. This would not be an armored car with a machine gun bolted on for show. It would be a genuine fighting vehicle, armed like a light tank, riding on wheels instead of tracks. The gun selected for the new vehicle was the Ordnance quick-firing 2-pounder, a 40-millimeter weapon already in service on British tanks, including the Crusader and the Valentine, firing an armor piercing round at roughly 792 meters per second. The 2-pounder could defeat the armor of any German armored car in service, and most early model Panzers at typical engagement ranges. No other nation's reconnaissance vehicle carried anything close to this firepower. The turret itself came directly from the light tank, marked the 7th, known as the Tetrarch, giving this new wheeled vehicle a gun and turret combination, equivalent to a British tank roughly 3 times its weight, backed by a coaxial 7.9 2mm Besa machine gun fed from belts of 2,700 rounds. The 2-pounder carried one real limitation. For much of its service life, it had no effective, high explosive shell, which made it a poor choice against infantry in trenches, gun emplacement, or buildings. It was a weapon built purely to kill armored vehicles, not to support infantry in a general-purpose role. For a reconnaissance car whose main enemies were expected to be other armored cars and half-tracks, this trade-off made sense. And it was one the desert had already shown to be the correct priority. Making all of this work demanded engineering that went well beyond anything the Dingo required. The new vehicle weighed roughly 7,500 kilograms, nearly double its smaller cousin. And that weight created serious problems for a wheeled chassis expected to move like a scout car rather than lumber like a tank. Shellard's solution was a Wilson pre-selector gearbox paired with a fluid flywheel, a system that let the driver select the next gear in advance and then engage it instantly with a tap of a pedal, while the fluid coupling made it almost impossible to stall the engine, even in the middle of a firefight. 5 forward gears and 5 reverse gears delivered identical performance in either direction, meaning a crew could fire on an enemy vehicle, then reverse away at full speed without ever turning the hull around, keeping the gun trained on the threat the entire time. An H-drive layout sent separate propeller shafts out to each wheel, with epicyclic reduction gearing built into the hubs themselves, giving the vehicle enough torque to climb slopes steep enough to stop most tracked vehicles cold, independent coil spring suspension on all 4 wheels, and Girling hydraulic disc brakes, remarkably advanced for 1941, rounded out a design that let the vehicle cross broken ground at speeds that startled observers used to slower, heavier armored cars. A 95 horsepower Daimler engine pushed the finished vehicle to 50 miles per hour on a road, with an operational range of roughly 200 miles. Production began in April 1941 at Daimler's Radford Works in Coventry, and almost immediately the war intervened in the most direct way possible. On the night of the 8th of April, 1941, the Luftwaffe struck Coventry in a raid that wrecked half of the Radford factory, destroying stores, tool rooms, and the drawing offices where the vehicle had been designed. Daimler responded by scattering production across roughly 40 separate sites rather than trying to rebuild in one vulnerable location. Armored car assembly moved to Wolverhampton. Gearboxes were built and Bren guns assembled at a hosiery factory in the town of Leek. Turrets were fabricated at an underwear factory in Colville. It was an unglamorous, almost absurd solution. Tank turrets rolling off the same lines that had once produced stockings and undergarments. But it worked. Production climbed steadily despite the disruption, with 135 vehicles completed in 1941 and 721 more in 1942. The first substantial numbers reaching reconnaissance regiments preparing to test this strange new machine against the German army in the desert. The 11th Hussars, the same regiment whose crews had spent 2 years running from German armor in Marmon-Harrington and Humber armored cars, began receiving Daimlers in the early months of 1942. The change this brought to reconnaissance work was not gradual. It was immediate, and it was total. Patrols that had spent years under strict orders to break contact the moment the enemy appeared now had a choice they had never possessed before. For the first time, a British scout crew could see a German half-track or armored car at 400 yards and decide deliberately to fight rather than flee. with a real chance of winning that fight and living to report what they had learned. The tactical logic of this reversal was simple. Once the vehicles were in crews' hands, the 2-pounder could punch through the armor of a German SD KFZ 222 at any range where the German gun could still reach out and hit the Daimler in return. While the Daimler's own armor, 14 millimeters at the front, was thick enough to shrug off hits from the German 20 millimeter autocannon at the same distances. In an engagement that had once been entirely one-sided in Germany's favor, the two vehicles now met on something close to equal terms, except the British crew usually saw the German vehicle first, and the Daimler could reverse away at full speed the instant the fight went wrong. Guns still pointed at the threat. One account from a trooper serving with a reconnaissance regiment in this period put it plainly. For the first time, they had a car that could outfight the German equivalent rather than simply outrun it, or fail to inside the turret. The change felt physical before it felt tactical. A gunner who had spent 2 years in a Humber knew the particular helplessness of watching an enemy vehicle grow larger in his sights, while his own weapon did nothing but announce his position in a Daimler. That same moment carried a different weight entirely. The traverse handle spun smoothly under his palm. The sighting telescope settled on the enemy hull, and the 2-pounder's breech held a shell that could actually end the engagement rather than merely provoke it. Drivers described the fluid flywheel transmission almost affectionately. The way the engine note never faltered, even when a driver dumped the clutch pedal in a panic reverse. The way 5 gears in either direction meant a car could claw backward off a ridge at nearly the same speed it had driven onto it. Crews who had once measured a patrol's success by how quietly they had avoided contact began, cautiously at first, to measure it by how many enemy vehicles they had put out of action and brought their own crew home to describe. None of this made the desert gentler. Sand worked into every hinge and bearing, gumming sights and jamming hatches, if crews were not fanatical about cleaning routine. Heat inside the turret during a stationary daytime watch could be suffocating, and men still had to keep their eyes pressed to vision, blocks scoured hazy by blown grit. But for the first time, the danger cut both ways, and that single change reshaped how reconnaissance regiments thought about their own mission. The psychological effect on the German side was just as important as the technical one. Even if it left no numbers in the ledger, German reconnaissance crews who had operated for 2 years with something close to impunity against British scout cars now found themselves engaging vehicles that could kill them at ranges where their own weapons did nothing. Patrols that had once probed forward confidently began to hesitate, aware that the British car sitting motionless on a distant ridge might simply be waiting for a clean shot rather than preparing to withdraw. Reconnaissance on both sides is built as much on nerve as on hardware, and the Daimler quietly stripped away an advantage the German army had enjoyed since the war in the desert began. Through the second half of 1942, the 2nd Derbyshire Yeomanry, serving as the reconnaissance regiment of the 7th Armored Division, carried their Daimlers into the fighting at Alam el Halfa and then into the Second Battle of El Alamein, running screening operations that kept German reconnaissance blind to the true strength and positioning of Commonwealth forces, while gathering intelligence on Rommel's own dispositions at Alam Halfa in particular. The regiment's task was less about destroying enemy vehicles than about denying Rommel's own scouts the picture they needed before his attempted flanking attack toward the ridge. A screen of Daimlers spread across miles of open ground meant German reconnaissance patrols probing forward for a gap in the British line kept running into vehicles that would not simply withdraw and report, forcing them to fight for information they might once have gathered by driving past unopposed. Every hour that German commanders spent uncertain of what lay ahead of them was an hour the defense behind that screen used to prepare, and a scout car that could hold a position long enough to force that uncertainty was worth far more to the battle than its size on a map suggested. The King's Dragoon Guards, who had begun the Desert War equipped with the same underpowered Marmon Harringtons that had frustrated the 11th Hussars, pushed forward with their new Daimlers into territory that earlier armored cars would have had to avoid entirely, engaging targets of opportunity that once would have simply been reported and left alone. The pursuit that followed El Alamein carried Daimler crews across a stretch of North Africa most of them had never expected to see except on a map. Tripoli fell to the advancing 8th Army on the 23rd of January 1943, and reconnaissance regiments equipped with Daimlers were among the first vehicles into the city, rolling past abandoned Italian positions and cheering crowds after months of fighting across nothing but open desert. The advance continued into Tunisia through the spring, where the terrain narrowed and the remaining Axis forces fought with the particular desperation of an army with its back against the sea. When the Axis surrender in Tunisia came in May 1943, it closed a campaign that had begun with British reconnaissance crews fleeing from enemies they could not fight and ended with those same regiments. In new vehicles, having helped push that enemy out of an entire continent, night patrols during this period demanded a particular kind of nerve. A Daimler crew screening a division's flank after dark ran with engines throttled low, straining to separate the sound of a distant enemy vehicle from the wind, moving sand across open ground. Watching for the faint blue hooding of enemy headlamps against a horizon with no other light for miles. A wrong turn in the dark could put a crew inside a minefield or, worse, inside range of a German outpost before either side knew the other was there. What the Daimler offered in these moments was not just firepower but confidence. The knowledge that a chance contact did not have to end in a one-sided massacre as the German and Italian line broke after El Alamein and the pursuit rolled west across Libya and into Tunisia. Daimler crews accounted for a growing tally of German half-tracks, armored cars, and unarmored transport, picking off stragglers and rear guards during a retreat that covered more than 1,000 miles in a matter of weeks. The comparison between the Daimler and its German counterparts only sharpened as the war went on, and the sharpest comparison of all came from a vehicle that never fought the Daimler in any great numbers. Late in the war, the Germans introduced the SD-KFC 234/2, nicknamed the Puma, an 8-wheeled reconnaissance vehicle mounting a 50-millimeter gun with genuinely formidable penetration, 30 millimeters of front armor, and a range of roughly 1,000 kilometers. On paper, the Puma outclassed the Daimler in almost every category that mattered. Post-war assessments have often called it the finest armored car of the war. But only 101 Pumas were ever built, a rounding error next to the 2,694 Daimlers that eventually left British production line. And German reconnaissance doctrine still instructed crews to avoid decisive engagement wherever possible, treating combat as a last resort rather than a tool. A superior gun sitting in a factory or mounted on a vehicle whose crew has been trained to run from a fight wins nothing. The British had built a worse vehicle on paper and armed it with a doctrine that let it fight, and in the numbers that actually reached the front, that combination beat the alternative. A designer chasing the best possible specification sheet would have built the Puma. A commander trying to win a war of attrition against an enemy who could always outproduce him on paper needed something else entirely. A vehicle simple enough to build in hosiery mills and underwear factories, reliable enough to survive 1,000 miles of desert pursuit, and armed just well enough to let its crew choose the terms of a fight rather than merely survive one. That, more than any single technical figure, was the real lesson of the comparison. An unlikely comparison came from Britain's own ally. The United States built more than 12,000 vehicles in the M8 Greyhound family, prioritizing speed of production over protection in a way the Daimler program never did. The Greyhound carried a comparable 37mm gun, but its floor armor measured only 3 to 6 millimeters thick, leaving crews dangerously exposed to mines, a growing threat, as the fighting moved into more heavily mined terrain in Italy and later in France. British crews who found themselves operating borrowed or attached Greyhounds took to lining the floor with sandbags, a crude but telling improvisation. The Daimler, with its better protected hull and independent suspension on all four wheels, consistently earned the preference of British crews given a choice between the two, even though it rode on four wheels to the Greyhound 6. The Italian campaign, beginning with the 11th Hussars landing at Salerno on the 16th of September 1943, tested the Daimler in terrain nothing like the open desert that had shaped its early reputation. The regiment took part in the capture of Naples and then the crossing of the Volturno, where retreating German engineers had dropped every bridge across the river and dug in around the town of Capua to slow the advance. The wide, open sweeps of desert reconnaissance gave way to narrow mountain roads, blown bridges, and defended river crossings, conditions that rewarded patience and local knowledge. As much as speed, the Daimler adapted well enough to this different kind of war. Its tight turning circle and reversing speed suited to the ambush and withdraw tactics that narrow roads demanded. Even as the wide-open sprints across open desert that had defined North Africa became a memory, the character of the fighting changed as much as the landscape. In the desert, a Daimler crew could often see trouble coming from miles away, a dust plume on the horizon, giving them minutes to choose their ground. In the hills above the Volturno, visibility might drop to the length of a single switchback road, a stone farmhouse, or a blown culvert, forcing every vehicle in the column to slow to walking pace at exactly the moment German gunners dug into the high ground. Wanted them to crews learned to listen for the particular echo of an engine bouncing off a valley wall, to read a road for the telltale signs of a demolition charge freshly laid, and to trust the Daimler's reverse gears more than ever, since there was rarely room on a mountain track to turn a vehicle around under fire. Rain turned dust to mud within hours, and more than one crew found themselves working a winch or manhandling their own vehicle out of a flooded ditch, while conscious that the enemy holding the next ridge line had every incentive to make that job as costly as possible. A Daimler's fighting compartment held 3 men, a commandant, a gunner, and a driver, packed into a space barely large enough for all of them to move at once. And campaigns like the one grinding up the Italian peninsula tested the bond between those 3 men, as much as they tested the machine itself. A driver had to trust his commander's read of a narrow road well enough to reverse its speed without seeing what lay behind him. A gunner had to trust that the driver would hold the vehicle steady enough for a shot to count, even while maneuvering under fire on ground that gave him nowhere flat to stand. And all 3 had to trust that the other 2 would notice immediately if one of them stopped responding over the intercom. Regiments that fought together from the desert through Italy and into Northwest Europe built a kind of shorthand between crews that no training manual could teach, a familiarity with each other's instincts that made the difference between a patrol that came home and one that did not. That trust, built over years and hundreds of miles, mattered as much to the Daimler's fighting record as any figure on an armor plate or any number stamped on a shell casing. Then came the 6th of June, 1944, and a test unlike anything the Daimler had faced before, the Inns of Court Regiment, the only armored car unit assigned to land on D-Day itself, went ashore with C Squadron attached to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division at Juno Beach. The regiment had structured itself for exactly this kind of mission, organizing around light troops built on pairs of tiny Dingo scout cars and heavy troops built around 3 Daimler armored cars each, one of which had its turret removed entirely to create what crews called a sawn-off Daimler. a low, fast command car that could slip through gaps a full-sized turreted vehicle could not. Their orders were audacious: race inland ahead of the main invasion force in small, independent armored groups and destroy the bridges over the river Orne south of Caen before German reinforcements, particularly the 21st Panzer Division, could use them to reach the beachhead. For the crews waiting in their vehicles below decks that morning, the noise alone was enough to make conversation impossible. Naval guns firing over their heads in a continuous rolling thunder, while landing craft pitched in a swell that left more than one trooper seasick before the ramp had even dropped. When the ramps did go down, engines that had been idling for hours suddenly roared as drivers fought for traction on sand, still churned by the assault infantry ahead of them. Smoke and cordite hanging low over a beach littered with obstacles. The engineers had not yet cleared. The landing itself was brutal. Daimlers went ashore into a beach still thick with mines, obstacles, and German strongpoints firing 88mm guns that could kill an armored car with a single round, regardless of how thick its armor was. Vehicles were lost within hours, some to mines before they had gone more than a few hundred yards inland, others to anti-tank fire from positions that had survived the naval bombardment. Crews who had trained for months for this single mission found themselves fighting simply to get off the beach, let alone reach the bridges they had been sent to destroy. Men who had rehearsed the drive inland on maps and sand tables in England now navigated by half-burned signposts and the wrecks of vehicles that had gone in ahead of them, and yet the regiment pushed forward despite the losses of that first day. Elements of the Inns of Court fought their way inland and carried out enough of their mission that the unit was later remembered as having covered itself in glory, a phrase officers do not use lightly about a day that cost them, men and machines, within hours of touching French sand. The Daimler's willingness to fight back, even against weapons that could kill it outright, gave its crews a fighting chance that the Marmon Harringtons and Humbers of 1940 would never have offered on a beach like that one. By 1944, the war those crews were fighting had changed as much as the vehicles fighting it. The Panzer divisions the Daimler had first met in the open desert had been reinforced in Normandy by newer, far more heavily armored designs, Panther and Tiger tanks, whose frontal plates, the original 2-pounder shell, could no longer be relied upon to defeat at any range that kept a Daimler crew safe. A gun that had overmatched every German armored car in 1941 now needed help simply to stay relevant against the newest German armor rolling off production lines. It had never been designed to face. The 2-pounder gun, revolutionary in 1941, was beginning to show its age against the newer, better armored German vehicles appearing on the battlefield. The answer came from an unexpected source years earlier in Czechoslovakia. An engineer named František Janeček, founder of the Jawa Motorcycle Company, had begun researching what became known as squeeze-bore ammunition. His son, František Janeček, carried that research to Britain after fleeing the German occupation. The device that carried the family name into English, anglicized to the Little John adapter, was a tapered attachment that screwed onto the muzzle of the 2-pounder and literally squeezed a specially designed shell as it left the barrel, compressing the softer outer casing around a hard tungsten core and dramatically increasing both muzzle velocity and penetration. Fitted with this adapter, Daimlers fighting through Northwest Europe in 1944 could threaten armor that would have been untouchable for the original gun. The tungsten cored ammunition was scarce, rationed by supply shortages of the metal itself, and the adapter made the gun useless for firing high explosive rounds entirely, but it required no change to the vehicle itself. Simply a fitting bolted onto a gun that had already been in service for 3 years. It was a small, clever solution that said as much about the soundness of Shellard's original design as it did about wartime ingenuity. a 1939 platform still being upgraded to stay relevant 5 years into a war that had already made most of its contemporaries obsolete. None of this fighting happened without an enormous, mostly invisible effort behind the front line. Every mile a Daimler covered its speed across sand or mud demanded a matching mile of work from fitters and recovery crews, working out of workshop lorries parked well behind the action, stripping sand-packed transmissions, replacing brake linings worn thin by mountain descents, and coaxing engines back to life with parts cannibalized from vehicles too badly damaged to repair. A crew's confidence in reversing at full speed out of a firefight meant nothing if the fluid flywheel behind them had not been serviced properly the night before. And the regiments that kept their Daimlers fighting hardest were, as often as not, the ones whose maintenance sections never stopped working, laboring by hooded torchlight long after the fighting troops had been allowed to sleep. By the end of the summer of 1944, Daimler armored cars had fought across the width of North Africa, through Sicily and up the length of Italy and inland from the beaches of Normandy through weeks of grinding fighting in the hedgerows of France. Crews who had joined their regiments as replacements after Normandy heard the older hands talk about the desert the way soldiers always talk about an earlier campaign, with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief that they had survived it, and found it hard to imagine open ground where a car could see an enemy coming from 2 miles away, rather than fighting blind between hedges that pressed in on both sides of every lane. Ahead of all of them now lay open country again. As the front finally broke out of Normandy and Allied columns began racing east across France faster than anyone had planned for, cities waited to be liberated, and the strange car built to do what no reconnaissance vehicle was supposed to do was about to lead the way into some of them. On the evening of the 3rd of September, 1944, a young Belgian officer named Roger de Wandry sat behind the controls of a Daimler Mark II he had named Calamity, at the head of a small vanguard from the 1st Belgian Armored Car Squadron, part of the exiled Belgian brigade commanded by Jean-Baptiste Piron. De Wandry and his men had trained in Britain for 4 years, for exactly this moment, and now they pushed forward ahead of the main Allied advance, racing to reach the capital of their own occupied country before anyone else could. Calamity's engine carried de Wandry across the city limits of Brussels that evening, making his Daimler the first Allied armored vehicle to enter the Belgian capital. What followed inside the city had little to do with tactics. Streets that had been silent and watchful under 4 years of German occupation erupted as word spread that Allied vehicles had arrived. Crowds surged around Calamity and the cars following it, climbing onto the hulls, pressing flowers and bottles of wine into the hands of startled crews, weeping and shouting and reaching through hatches to touch the men inside as though needing physical proof that the occupation had actually ended. For a vehicle designed around cold calculations of armor thickness and gun penetration, this was a use its engineers in Coventry could never have anticipated. A war machine transformed for one evening into a symbol simply by being first through the gates. De Wandry himself had left Belgium years earlier to reach Britain and continue the fight from exile. One of thousands of Belgians who had crossed occupied Europe or the Channel by whatever means they could find, and driving Calamity back into his own capital, closed a personal circle that had nothing to do with armor plate or muzzle velocity. For the crews behind him, men who had trained on English airfields and gunnery ranges for years without knowing when or whether they would ever see their families again. The noise of that crowd was the sound every mile of training had been aimed toward, even if none of them could have described it in those terms while it was happening. The Belgian squadron and the wider Piron brigade it belonged to did not stop in Brussels. They fought on through the Netherlands and into Germany itself before the war's end. But de Wandry's ride into his home capital remained the single moment for which the unit and the Daimler beneath him would be remembered longest 2.5 weeks later Daimlers were doing very different work, 80 miles to the northeast. Operation Market Garden had already begun to unravel by the third week of September, with British paratroopers surrounded and fighting for their lives at Arnhem, while ground forces struggled to punch a corridor north fast enough to relieve them. In the pre-dawn fog of the 22nd of September, Daimler armored cars of the 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment, scouting ahead of the ground advance, found a gap in German positions west of the village of Driel and drove straight through it without firing a shot, reaching the beleaguered 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade Group on the riverbank opposite Arnhem. 8 armored vehicles carrying working radios and roughly 20 soldiers reached the Poles that morning. The first tangible contact between the relief force and paratroopers who had been fighting isolated and increasingly desperate for days. The wider operation still failed. The bridge at Arnhem itself was never secured, and the campaign would be remembered as a bridge too far. But the reconnaissance that found a way through to Driel, Infog, past German positions that would have stopped a less capable vehicle, represented the very best that a scout car built to fight rather than flee could still deliver, even when the larger battle around it was being lost. For the Polish paratroopers, who had spent days fighting off German counterattacks with dwindling ammunition and no clear word of when help might arrive, the sight of Daimlers rolling out of the fog with working radios and reinforcements aboard was proof that the corridor north still existed. Even if the bridge at Arnhem itself never would be secured, reconnaissance crews rarely receive credit for battles. Their information did not win outright. But the drive to Driel stands as a reminder that finding a path through when every obvious route has failed can matter every bit as much as any single engagement fought along the way. The war's final months carried the Daimler back to where the 11th Hussars had first proven it, in the sense that the same regiment closed out the fighting in Europe that it had opened in the Western Desert 2.5 years earlier. On the 3rd of May 1945, following the surrender of the city's German commander, General Woltz, the 11th Hussars led the 7th Armored Division into the ruins of Hamburg. The regiment that had taken delivery of the first Daimlers in early 1942, now driving them into the heart of what had been the Third Reich. Between the Western Desert and Hamburg, Daimler-equipped regiments had fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally Germany itself, a span of campaigns no other British armored car of the war could claim to have covered in full. Troopers who had joined the regiment as teenagers in 1942, young men sent into a war whose reconnaissance crews had once been all but expected to die quietly and unnoticed, drove into a defeated German city 3 years later in the same type of vehicle. Veterans now, rather than volunteers, having watched that vehicle change what their job actually meant to survive. The peace that followed did not retire the Daimler, and this final twist may be the strangest part of its whole wartime and post-war story, stranger in its own quiet way than anything that had happened in the desert. In the mid-1940s, the British Army began developing the Coventry armored car as its formal successor, a heavier, more modern design meant to replace the Daimler across the post-war army. Testing in early service quickly revealed that the newer vehicle offered little real improvement, and production plans originally intended for around 1,700 Coventry armored cars were cut back sharply to only 227. The vehicle that was supposed to make the Daimler obsolete never came close to replacing it in practice. Daimlers themselves stayed in frontline British service for another decade and a half, still equipping B Squadron of the 11th Hussars on security duties in Northern Ireland as late as January 1960. Nearly 20 years after Sid Shellard's team had first started sketching a wheeled vehicle with a tank gun bolted into it, other nations kept the Daimler fighting even longer. India's President's Bodyguard and 63rd Cavalry operated Daimlers alongside Humbers, and vehicles from these units helped defend the remote outpost of Chushul during the brief but bitter Sino-Indian War of 1962, fighting at altitude in terrain about as far from the Libyan desert as it was possible to get. The island nation, then still called Ceylon, took delivery of 12 Daimlers in 1959 to equip its newly formed 1st Reconnaissance Regiment, and those same vehicles were still in Sri Lankan service through the 1971 insurrection and into the early years of the Sri Lankan Civil War, with at least one Daimler destroyed in the fighting at the First Battle of Elephant Pass, keeping this 1941 design in frontline combat use into the final years of the 20th century. When the British Army finally did settle on a true Daimler replacement, the small, fast-ferret scout car, that new vehicle inherited the H-drive transmission, the pre-selector gearbox, and the low reconnaissance silhouette that Shellard's team had pioneered, carrying his engineering philosophy forward into an entirely new generation of Cold War fighting vehicles. Of the 2,694 Daimler armored cars built across the war, only a small number, roughly 24, survive today in museums and private collections, most of them showing the scars of decades of hard service rather than sitting as pristine parade pieces. That scarcity is itself a kind of evidence. A vehicle used carefully, kept in reserve, sees relatively few of its numbers destroyed or scrapped. A vehicle used the way British and Commonwealth crews used the Daimler, hunting rather than hiding, fighting rather than fleeing, gets worn out and used up in the process, which is exactly what happened to nearly every one of the 2,600 that rolled out of Coventry, Wolverhampton, and a hosiery mill in Leek. The handful that remain today sit in museum halls in Britain, Belgium, and beyond. Their 2-pounder barrels, silent, visited by people who mostly have no idea that the compact, oddly proportioned car in front of them once talked a crew out of running for the first time in the history of reconnaissance warfare. The strange British armored car that hunted tanks instead of running from them was never really strange at all. Once its origins are understood, it was the direct answer to a question every other army in the war either failed to ask or refused to answer honestly. Reconnaissance crews everywhere faced the same basic problem, needing to see the enemy without being destroyed by him. And almost every army answered it by telling their crews to run. The British spent 2 years watching that answer get their own men killed in the desert, and then built a vehicle that let crews choose for themselves whether a fight was worth having. From a ridge in the Libyan desert in 1942 to the outskirts of Hamburg in 1945, from a jubilant crowd in Brussels to a lonely outpost above Chushul 2 decades later, that choice, more than any single statistic about armor, thickness, or muzzle velocity, is the real reason the Daimler armored car earned a combat record no other reconnaissance vehicle of its era could match. And the real reason a wheeled scout car designed to observe quietly from a distance ended up against every prevailing doctrine of its time. Hunting tanks instead,